So you want to buy a 240, 260, or 280Z. Well, before you do, let me tell you some of the things that you should probably be looking for when buying one of these cars. Now, I've gone through the purchase process of these cars more times than I would like to admit. I first bought this 280Z as well as even some ZXs. And so I've been through this process quite a few times, and each time I've discovered something that I didn't realize you should probably be looking for from the last. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the things that you should probably be looking for when actually buying a 240, 260, or 280Z. So first off, I want to go over the difference between 240, 260, and 280, at least some of the major differences. The 240Z is the most popular out of all of the Zs. In fact, I've made my 280Z look like a 240Z because they are the best looking out of the three Zs. Now, while they all share the same chassis, there were just minor differences between each year, just so Nissan or Datsun could facelift each model. Starting with 240, it had the longest production run out of all three cars. It went from 1969 all the way up to into 1973 before they decided to rebrand and go with the 260Z. That original Datsun was a 2.4 liter engine, hence the name 240Z. They also made a Fairlady Z over in Japan, which I believe was a 2-liter engine, but it shared the same body as the 240, 260, and 280Z. Those go for 200, 300 grand. They're a lot of money for an original Fairlady Z, and they are quite hard to find. Moving to the 260Z, that was made from 1974 to 1976. There wasn't much changed here. Main thing was they went from a 2.4 liter to a 2.6 liter. While it is still an L series engine, all they did was bore it out to 2.6 liters. Hence the name 260Z. In 1977 to 1978, that's when they came out with the 280Z, which was the final year of the S30 chassis, which is the sleekest, smoothest chassis out of any Z generation made. This got a 2.8 liter fuel injected engine rather than the 2.6 or 2.4 liter carbureted engines in the previous two generations. Now, none of these cars came turboed, at least not. So if you're going to be buying an original Z, if it is turboed, that means it has been modified, at least to my knowledge. There might have been some special edition out there, but nothing that I know of. Now, the most popular one is the 240Z. It's the one that everybody wants. These things are starting to go for upwards of 30K, even in not great condition. Say, even if you find a rusted out chassis, these can be somewhere around $8,000 to $10,000. And there's really not much reason for that other than they have the 240Z name. That's what it is. This is the original Japanese muscle car, so the 240Z holds a higher value other than the 260 and 280, even though it was the one that was made the most because it had the longest run of models. But you're really not getting much other than an original 240Z name. Now, yes, there are some things that are unique to the 240, but if you just want the general look of the car and maybe even just make like a 260 or 280 look like a 240, it's not very hard to do. The hardest part about it is the 280s came with these big safety bumpers, which I removed off of this car to make it look like a 240. So if you just want the look and you want the bigger engine, the 280 might be the better choice for you. Now, the cheapest out of all three cars is the 260Z, surprisingly. It's kind of the weird middle child that no one really talks about, but there wasn't any huge changes other than the engine going up 0.2 liters. The 280Z is when you got fuel injection. It was a better car than the 260 and even the 240, but the 260 didn't have the 240 name. So the most popular years are the 240, then the 280, and then the 260. So the cheapest way into getting into an S30 chassis is through 260. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's go over some of the things that you should look for on the car itself. Now, I'm not going in any particular order here, but I'm gonna just kind of touch on some things that I've discovered from this car and other cars that you should probably know. Now, with any classic car, you should probably be inspecting the paint. If you can see if it's an original paint or not, that's gonna be a huge factor, especially if you don't know who painted it. This one has been repainted, and it was repainted by a collision shop, not really a classic car restoration shop, so the paint chips super easily. And that is one of the things that I wish I knew about when I was in college buying this car, is when I do have to go eventually repaint this car, which I pretty much guaranteed will, I bet there's a lot of Bondo under here. I bet there's some things that, and this is going to be a very expensive paint job to redo. Paint jobs for a good one go for $25,000 plus nowadays. And so if you're buying a $10,000 car with a bad paint job, that's more like a $35,000 car because you're gonna have to get it repainted. Now, one of the first questions you should probably ask yourself when buying a Z is, what do you wanna do with your Z? Do you wanna drive it? Do you wanna collect it? Do you wanna restore it? What do you wanna do? Because a lot of these Zs have been modified, and I wouldn't let that scare you away. Unless you're trying to collect it and hold it for value or collector's sake, I wouldn't let a modified Z scare you away, because a lot of the modifications are actually probably a good thing on these cars. For example, I have wheelwood brakes, front and rear. I've converted the rear drums to disc brakes, and this thing stops a whole lot better now. The original brakes on this car, they're 40-year-old brakes. They are way outdated, and they really do need to be updated. So I wouldn't let aftermarket brakes scare you. Just make sure that they were done correctly, because you don't want your brakes going out on you. Along those lines, I would also say that aftermarket headlights aren't a scary thing, especially if they're from Dapper headlights. These are actually super high quality, and they are super bright headlights. They modernize your headlights. The original headlights are just no good. They are not usable. They're not safe. And so if they have some Dapper lighting headlights, I'd say that's a good thing. There are some eBay headlights that are like 50 bucks. While I wouldn't say that they're bad, I wouldn't add value to the car for those. These Dapper lighting headlights, I would say that these are way better and they're way more expensive because of that. So this is definitely a value add. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is under the hood, and actually having to do with the hood itself. A lot of these hoods, there are two things you should be looking for. One, if they latch all the way, a lot of these latches have failed over time. Now again, this is where an aftermarket piece could fix this from someone like Techno Toy Tuning. They have an aftermarket hood latch that should fix this problem. Along with, you should see if the hood actually goes up and stays up. This does have the stock hood hinges, just that have been replaced with a spring. That, I would say, is a worthwhile investment if you want to either do billet hood hinges from someone like Apex Engineered, or you just refurbish the stock spring. It's something that you should probably look for as well. Now, underneath the hood, there are a few things that you should be looking for. Now, this one is a pretty bare bones engine. Everything has been removed except the engine, so there is no heater core or no air conditioning. Now, if that's something that's important to you, you should probably be looking for that. But for me, this is a race car. I don't really care about that. But one of the most important things, as you can see, this is a completely modified engine. I have a new fuel rail on here, and I even have a brand new engine wiring harness. That was probably one of the best upgrades that I did. The original fuel rail is quite bulky on these cars. Again, these are very early fuel injection systems, so they are not very refined, and it definitely shows when driving the car. So the fuel rail is a great upgrade. Along with that, the engine management system makes it very easy to tune the car, and it modernizes the entire engine bay. The original one has a heater core block right here. If it does have the original harness and it runs and drives, make sure that heater core block isn't leaking. That's an easy piece to fail, and that actually controls your idle based on temperature. So something to look for. It sits right here on the intake manifold on these 280Zs. I would definitely be looking for that. If you want to stay original stock, make sure it is in good condition. Now, these are old engines. I would check the timing chain. A lot of that has to be redone. See if there are any records of it being changed recently. I would also bring a compression tester. Check the compression of these engines. These engines are 40, 50-year-old engines at this point, so they are probably due for a rebuild if they haven't had one already. So if they have been rebuilt, make sure it's been rebuilt by someone professional. I recommend Godzilla Raceworks. I really like them. There's also Rob's Performance Motorsport, or RPM. I would recommend both of those guys for rebuilding engines, especially with these Datsun engines. Now, you can also rebuild these yourself. They're actually very easy to rebuild yourself. They are just a stack and inline six. So if you want to try to attempt it, there are a few videos out there to rebuild it. Now, another piece to look at in the engine bay is right here below the brake and clutch reservoirs, below this panel here. Now, if you're not familiar, brake and clutch fluid is super corrosive. It will eat away paint, metal, pretty much anything it touches if it has enough time to do it. And luckily for us, Datsun engineers put a metal shelf basically right below this that is part of the frame that catches all the brake fluid right onto it. So go directly below this, see if there's any rust on this frame, or at least any major rust. I would expect there to at least be surface rust and some paint missing, but if it's rusted all the way through, that is a major piece that you're going to have to replace. That's going to add another $1,000, $2,000 to this build if you pay someone to do it. Even if you do it yourself, it's just going to be a bunch of hassle. Now, moving back along the side of the car, there are probably a few things that you should be inspecting here. One, make sure that the doors sit flush and that they don't sag when you open them. This is pretty much typical for any classic car. Datsun doors don't sag too crazy, but I would definitely check it. Also check along the bottom edge here. Make sure that that is straight and narrow. If it isn't, that probably means the chassis has been twisted. A lot of these older rusted out cars are going to have a twisted chassis from either a collision or just over time it's been rusted into the ground into a kind of an odd position. These are very hard to straighten out once they do get kinked, so just another thing to be looking for. Now, more important than that, you should be checking down here along this rocker here. I would bring a magnet with you. If the car has been repainted, and depending on who repainted it, they probably had to do some rust repair. And there's two ways to do rust repair. The right way, which is replacing the panel with some new metal, welding it in, and doing some weld through primer, and then priming it, painting it, making it all smooth from there. Or you just cake a bunch of Bondo on it and hope it sticks. So bring a magnet with you. If it doesn't stick, that means there's a bunch of Bondo right there, and that is going to cost you a lot of money to repair that properly when it eventually does fail. Another good test is you can kind of knock along this, and if it sounds like metal or it's kind of a hollow metal sound, that's good. If it sounds like a rock all of a sudden, that means there is a bunch of Bondo caked on this car. One of the major spots that you need to look at is right back here along this rocker here. As you can hear, that kind of sounds like there's just a bunch of Bondo there, and there probably is on this car. However, up here, it sounds more like hollow metal. So that is kind of an indicator that this is probably more of a major restoration kind of project than a collectible car. Along with that, while we're in this area, underneath here, there's a pinch weld. A lot of people jack from the pinch weld on these cars like you do on modern day cars. Those are not the original jack points, and they will bend. I did it on this car. That was me being stupid in college. I know better now. The actual jack point is underneath the car, underneath the floor pan, which you should inspect. A lot of them are going to be bent up in a curve because over time they have failed, and replacing those is no easy task. Typically, if those have bent up, all floor pans have also been bent up, so they need to be replaced as well. It is a very common thing on these cars. Luckily, it is very doable, but I would recommend having it done by a professional welder, some professional auto body shop, because again, that is a very easy way to tweak the body if you don't know what you're doing. But that is probably the most important place to check on these cars, is underneath there. If you want to save yourself the most time and the most headache, check those frame rails and floor pans, and if they've already been replaced, see if they've been replaced with an OEM one or a full length one. The full length one will last a lot longer, and it will protect your car. Now, moving to the back of the car, this is another great place to be looking for rust. While these things were driving, they kicked up a bunch of water, dirt, everything right into this area here, all along the back bumper. Mine has had a bumper delete done, so it is completely smooth here, but along down here, you want to see if there is any Bondo. So I would knock along this area, I would knock along here. That sounds like metal. That sounds more like a rock. So another huge place to check, see if it's been rusted out, and if it has, to what extent. These panels can be found, especially in this area. There's usually collisions right in this area here. So you can actually find another Datsun and pull a piece off of it and replace it. Another really important area that I want to talk about is the roof. Now, these roofs, they're known for rusting out, mainly because they sit outside. But one of the things that happened in the early 70s and late 60s is vinyl tops started becoming very popular, especially on American cars. But some Americans wanted vinyl tops on their Japanese cars. So dealers would install a vinyl top on Datsuns. They went from about middle of the roof here, maybe all the way to the front of the roof, all the way down to the rear hatch. Now these, because they're vinyl and they're dealer installed, a lot of times water will get underneath those and they can't get out. So the only way that they can get out is rusting through the roof, through the headliner, and out. So if it still has a vinyl top on it, it's rusted for sure. There is rust underneath. Check underneath that. Along with that, there will be holes along the edge. That is something that you need to look for. These roof skins, you can't buy a replacement roof skin unless it's from an existing Datsun. So you either need to know how to make a new roof skin, or you need to find an existing roof skin and fully replace your roof from another Datsun. Now, there's a couple things you should be looking for inside the car. For example, there are usually cracks on the dash. That is a very typical thing. If it's been redone, that means it's been flocked, which means they just kind of redid the dash. If it's an OEM dash that hasn't cracked, I'd be really impressed. And some people will pay a premium for that. Usually to have a brand new dash like that, it's like $1,000 to $1,500 in the Datsun forums. But I would say that if that's really important to you, be sure to look out for that, because those dashes will crack very easily if they are left out in the sun. Now, a lot of times when you go buy a Datsun, the owner will say they have boxes and boxes of spare parts, and they say you can either sell them, you get a little bit of money out of it, or you can put them into the car and have a completely original car. From what I have found, there are not many people buying most of the Datsun parts that are available in those boxes. Usually it's fuel rails, maybe there's a couple of badges, usually it's some lower control arms, something like that. A lot of times people aren't going to be buying those parts unless it's maybe a differential, a transmission, a wiring harness, or a dash. I wouldn't say that people are really buying those pieces. And the reason why is most people just upgrade it to modern day technology that has the same feel, kind of like what I've done with this car. It's easier and actually cheaper to do, and a lot of the parts that you can end up selling, most of the time you can't sell them for much money. For example, a transmission for a Datsun I could probably get for like $100 in good condition. A dash is probably the most expensive thing, and that is about $1,000 to $2,000. Seats, interior pieces, anything like that kind of don't really break that $100 to $200 mark. Maybe for a ECU or engine harness, but I wouldn't add that to the value of a car. Now, while that's not something you necessarily look for on the car itself, it's just a factor that if you're going to buy one of these cars, I wouldn't let that influence your decision if there are boxes and boxes of parts, because more likely than not, you're just going to end up paying for a storage unit to store all said parts. I could talk for hours on what to look for exactly on each car, but those are the main things that you should be looking for. If you guys want me to go into even more detail or make a second video about either specifically a 280, specifically a 240, or specifically a 260, I can do that. But in the meantime, thank you guys for watching. Leave a comment on what you want me to do next, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye. Run out of all three cars. Oh my god, bro. This is insane. Any of the three, oh my god, holy shit.